Good morning. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the programming librarian at the Cary Library. Always happy to see you here for our sewing circle with Anna Rose Keefe. You know how, if you've been here before, you know how awesome she is. And if you haven't been, then you're about to learn. um, Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that we do have captions enabled for this program, and I will drop in, information on how to use them in the chat if you have never used them before. And as always, we like to thank the Cary Library Foundation for supporting all of our adult programs. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Becky, Anna Rose. I do have to say that what we will do is when Anna Rose is doing her demonstration, I'll be recording that part, and then when she's done with her demonstration, I'll turn off the recording so we can just chat. All right, Anna, it's all you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mina. I will say just before we start, I've got a confusing thing where the name underneath my face says Becky Keefe. So please ignore that. My name is Anna Rose Keefe, and I am so happy to be with you today. I'm happy to see a couple familiar names, a couple new faces. Last time we had our sewing circle, we talked a lot about repair and we talked about how to do Swiss darning on knits. And I think one thing that came out of that was a lot of interest in working with maybe finer knits, how to repair a fine, lightweight sweater. And so I promised that we would talk about how to repair moth holes on lightweight sweaters. So I'm just going to get straight into this, but I would encourage you, if you have questions, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask, or just drop them in the chat. If anything is confusing, I am happy to go back or explain something a little bit differently. But I do have a camera set up, so you should be able to follow along with what I'm doing with my hands. So Mina, if you wouldn't mind spotlighting the hand camera, I would love to just jump into this. Great, hand cam. Okay, so what we are going to talk about today is felted repairs on wool. This right here is an old wool shawl I've got. And so I'm going to use this as my example piece just to play around with. We've talked a lot about repairs in the past, about how if you have a moth hole, that might be a sign that the area around your hole is also damaged. Moths will often eat sort of unevenly away at wool. They'll kind of graze around. So I'm going to do some nice sort of larger, soft repairs on the very small holes that are scattered all around this shawl. There's a nice one. There's a nice one right there. So this textile is silk in one direction. You can see the fringe that's hanging off is this very fine silk, and wool in the other direction. For a felted repair, it will work best if you have at least some wool. You can think of this roving that we're going to work with. You can think of this as being kind of Velcro-y. And with our needle felting tools, we're going to kind of puncture this into the surface of the wool. We're going to activate those Velcro characteristics to patch up this hole in a way that's nice, secure, and can be either a really invisible mend if you pick a good color, or can be a nice sort of decorative moment if you want to have fun instead. But it will work best if you are felting wool roving into a wool textile or a wool sweater. So I just bought this online. All of the materials I have should be available at most craft stores. You can find a needle felting tool that's just single needles. Those are great if you want to do really fine detail work. I really like to work fast when I'm felting. I think it can be a really fast way of repairing moth holes if you have something that's got a lot of holes in it. So I bought one of these tools that has many different little needles in there, so I can work very quickly and I can cover ground really easily. This right here is a pad. You're going to need something that you can stab into. These needles are very sharp. You want to keep your fingers far away from your needles while you're working. You know, I've certainly cut myself. I've certainly bled before when needle felting. So you need a nice, secure thing that you can stab your needles into. This is a nail brush. It was purchased for cleaning nails, or it was sold for cleaning nails, and I purchased it for felting. But you can also work with the type of green foam that florists will use. You can use that. You can use other sort of foamy-like materials, as long as it's, relatively porous, as long as it won't, leave a weird residue on your textile, and as long as you can stab into it easily, you can use that as your base. So if I had a really ragged hole, if I had a sweater where there were maybe some yarns that had been pulled out, then I might want to clean it up. These holes right here, they're sort of soft, they're sort of irregular, but they're already pretty clean. There's not a lot hanging off it. So I am happy with this hole. I have centered it on my block, so I know I'm not going to accidentally sort of stab myself, stab my table while I'm felting. Gonna check the chat. Great. Okay. So I am going to tug off just a little bit of roving right here. This is merino, so it's a really long staple fiber. If you buy a different type of sheep's wool, if you buy something that's maybe a little bit hardier, cold weather hardy animal, can you hold up the hole, Paulette? Absolutely. Can you see that right there? There's my hole.
Yep, now we can see it.
Great, thank you. So you can see I've got the hole centered right there. I've got this very long staple fiber. Because it's a smaller hole, I'm just gonna fold it back on itself. As I said, the wool roving, it's a little bit like Velcro. The outside of wool has scales, has these little scales that will catch on each other. And the more you felt them down, the more you press down on them with those needles, I can sort of make a nice catch between my different little strands of roving. So I am going to do these in each direction. I want to encourage the scales to grab pretty securely. And then this is just very simple. I could spray water on this if I was worried about it, if I felt like it might not work. But I'm just going to start puncturing it with my tool. And you can see as I go over, this half is much flatter than this half. Now, what I'm working on right here, this is the back side of the textile. You can see this is sort of a fun abstract design almost. And if you flip over to the front, it's a much more classic paisley sort of shawl moment right there. If I wanted to do this invisibly, I could definitely try and match my fiber, my roving, to my textile, because what I'm going to wind up with is a very clear repair on the back and then a just sort of light hazy repair on the front. There. I think we have some questions about the tool. It is sold for needle felting. It is, I think, specifically a needle felting tool would be the name of it. That's how I'd search for it. As I said, you can buy individual needles or you can buy a punch tool like this that has a couple needles that'll work faster. If you want to do sort of fine, beautiful decorative repairs, I've got an object that I'm going to show you later that's an example of what you can do with a single needle. But if you want to do sort of fast repairs, if you want to do things more functionally, I would really recommend this needle felting punch tool. You can see I'm working on this, and as I'm going over it, it's getting flatter and flatter. It's kind of hazy. The edges of this are really soft, which is nice because it doesn't have the same look as a patch where you very clearly have a sharply defined edge where your patch ends and your textile begins. You can make very free form shapes. So as I pick this up, you can see it's pretty flat now. That's the textile held out. I've punctured a lot of the fiber to the back, so I've got a little haze on what is actually the front of the textile. And then I've got a pretty clear area on the back. So I'm going to flip this over. We are now working on the front of the textile, and you can see in this fuzzy area, that sort of three-dimensional spot. I'm going to go over this again with my needle felting tool. And I'm just working roughly in a grid. Virginia says, is there a specific brand or website that you recommend for buying wool for repairs? I would look at your fiber more than a brand or website. I really like ordering from Webb's, a yarn store in Northampton, Massachusetts. I think they are yarn.com, which is really easy to remember. But also, you know, I would encourage you to check out your local yarn store. I know there's one downtown in Lexington that I think is called Wild and Woolly. I don't know if that's still there, but I've always had a lot of fun shopping there as well. So you can see right now, this is pretty flat. Where once we had a hole, we now just have a very light, slightly orangey haze. I'm trying to find the area where the hole was. It was right there. Oh no, they went out of business. That's sad. Well, either way, support your local yarn stores. Buy some roving. It's fun to work with. So this was our hole. It's now been filled, and the area around it is also very secure. What I would do if I wanted to wear this, if I wanted to make sure that this was very secure, I would take it over to the sink and I would wash this in warm water and Dawn dish detergent. I would just sort of put, you know, this in my hand. I'd run hot water over it. I'd make sure I work over it just with my hands, with my fingers, add a little dish detergent, work it in, rinse it out until it was nice and smooth. That will encourage further felting. And then I think this would be secure enough to wear. Then I think you would have a repair that you could wash safely, that would be really securely made, that would be really well done. So I've got a couple other examples of things you can do. When you are felting, you can create shapes. You can certainly do this very decoratively. I made this with a cookie cutter. So you can use, you know, basically any shape you have. If you have a needle, you can just work inside the cookie cutter. I would start with the outsides. I would tease your felt down along the outsides of your shape, and then I'd go in throughout. And you can see on the back, this is where I started working on the back. It's a very defined, crisp shape. And on the front, it's sort of lighter, it's softer, it's hazier. So if I had a fiber that was the right color, I could make something that was relatively invisible, especially on a patterned textile. Now, I did not make this, but I want to show this to you anyways as an example of what you can do. So this was made by Becky Keefe, whose computer I am using. But you can see you can make very decorative designs. This is an example of something you would want to do with a single needle instead of the punch tool. You can lay down very fine wisps of roving. Just pull off a small amount at a time, twist it into shape, lay it down, and then felt it and create really beautiful kind of organic designs that can also be mends. So I think you can do sort of really fun, interesting repairs using this technique. And it doesn't have to be wool on wool, but it will work better. If you have a sort of, you know, material that's got a little bit of texture, the way sometimes cotton is really textured, you can buy silk that's a little bit textured. You can sometimes get the wool to bite into it, or certainly you could sandwich roving on either side of the fabric and you could create a felt based on that, but it's going to work a lot better if it's wool. So I would really recommend this technique for that.
Hey, Anna Rose, I have a
Yes.
question.
Yeah,
This is Mina.
perfect.
What I'm not quite understanding, like how how the wool stays in the material. Like what tethers it to the material so you don't have to actually sew it down or anything?
Absolutely. Good question. Thank you. So this has to do with the microscopic characteristics of wool. If you were to blow up a single wool fiber to say 50 or 100 times magnification, you would notice that it's kind of like a zigzag shape. It's got scales along the outside of it. And so what we are doing is we are forcing the different fibers together with the hopes that the scales will interlock. We are trying to create sort of a grasp between the two scales in the hopes that it'll stay there. And wool does this really, really well. If you add water, if you add moisture, that will help. But I mean, it's just a beautiful property of the fiber that it kind of wants to cling to itself. It's very happy, you know, existing in clumps. It doesn't necessarily want to pull off. I really do have to kind of tug them out in order to grab a little clump. But this combination of static and the shape of the fiber just makes it really act like Velcro. It's got a real affinity for itself.
And how long does the fix last? Is it pretty long lasting?
Yeah, what's awesome about this is the more you use it, the more you wash it, the more durable it will become. If you make sure that you go on both sides and maybe you get some hot water involved afterwards, you rinse it in hot water, you work it in, it should be permanent. This is a really long lasting technique, which is why I think it's a great tool to have. So,
Thank you.
of course. Now, Paulette, you asked a question about how you want to match something that you de-pilled. You want to use the pilling that you removed. Thank you so much. That is what I'm really excited to also talk with you about today, because I think this is one of the coolest techniques. Oh, and then Winifred also asked, what's the difference between roving and yarn, and can yarn be used as well? I would say that roving is definitely easier. You spin yarn out of roving. So in theory, you could unravel your yarns and then use them, but you would want to get sort of this loose, fuzzy type of wool. You wouldn't want to lay down a really tightly spun yarn. It would be much harder to work with. So I think if you unraveled your yarn until it looked a little bit like this, until you had just some loose fuzz, some loose fibers, I think you could definitely do some interesting things with that. So, but let's talk about using the fuzz that is already on your sweaters to repair your sweaters. So I've got a couple different things here that you can use for de-pilling sweaters. And we are going to repair this tiny hole in this cashmere sweater. I feel like these single snapped yarns are really common, especially when you're talking about moth holes. It's not like a giant rip, it's not a giant tear, but it's just a little snapped moment, and I want to be able to fix it. So there are different ways you can defuzz a sweater. I bought this comb, I think, at Joann Fabrics. I got this one from a local artist. This is just a sweater depiller. I don't love this, but if you have a giant sweater, it can be easier to use an electronic depiller that kind of goes over the surface, vacuums up the little pills. I personally think these work a little bit better. And you can, you know, make these. I think this is like a material used in drywall that you can find at Home Depot, or you can buy them at many different stores. When you are defuzzing a sweater, you want to get it really flat. I'm going to work quickly and with a little bit of pressure. And so I could distort this if, say, it is creased. I could maybe even make a hole. I could damage it. So I want to make sure that I have a nice flat surface. And I'm going to go in the direction of the knitting. I'm not going to work diagonally. I'm going to work very quickly, sort of on the same grid as the knitting. Now this is not that pilly, so I'm not getting very much, but I gathered up some earlier as well. If we don't get a lot, we can use other areas. You want to do this with a clean sweater. I'm noticing that even though this sweater is cream, some of the pills that I'm pulling off have little dark hairs in them. I don't know if this is pets or just from being out and about in the world, but you want to make sure that you clean a sweater before that you do this, because you don't want to wind up felting gray into your nice white material. Ooh, there's another hole. Virginia asked that Sylvia had a question, is wool the only natural fiber that can be repaired this way? Now, I've seen people do this with silk. I'm not going to talk about that because I don't really know how to do it. I've never tried it before, but I believe you can felt wool into other fibers, but I would not recommend using silk roving as the fuzz that you are applying. I would say that you can certainly use a different base material, but it'll be much easier if wool is what you are applying. And there's also a question from Virginia. When using the needle felting tool, if we don't have a flat brush to work over as you did, are there other surfaces? Absolutely. Any type of foam, certainly the foam that you use to make cushions, couch foam, you can definitely, oh, and don't be sorry for any questions. I love it. If you want to use this technique, you have to ask the questions. And I'm so thrilled that people maybe will try this themselves. Yeah, so anything that you can essentially stab into that's not going to grab onto your needle felting and make it impossible to pull it away. So you don't want something that's, I don't know, going to leave a residue. Certainly older foams, there are some that are kind of sticky. You want to avoid anything like that. But the green foam that florists use, those things that you stab flowers into, that's really common. A lot of needle felters will just use that. I like the brush personally, but you can use any sort of foam essentially. Yeah, and this definitely will help you avoid throwing out your old sweaters. This is a nice technique to save them. So this is the hole we're going to work on. I've got a little pile of fuzz right here. I am going to work from the back because it's always going to be most noticeable on the side where you apply your fuzz. So I'm going to put this down and felt it in the hopes that whatever gets pushed to the front, we can then felt down on the other side. So this is just my little pills. There are a couple, I don't know, I'm going to throw that out. I think there's a cat hair in that one. But yeah. So you can see I'm just working quickly and I'm going back and forth over the same spots while making sure that my roving stays centered around the hole. These needles are very sharp. I'm hitting the tag every once in a while and I'm going straight through the tag. So make sure that you are aware of where your fingers are at all times because you can easily stab yourself and it does hurt. Virginia says, is there a limit to the size of the hole? I wouldn't try this on anything larger than maybe 2 inches. I have certainly seen people do larger, but I would say that that is a really ambitious attempt and it will be less secure. But you could do a pretty large hole with this. The last thing I have has large holes on it, so that's what we're going to try. So you can see there, that is where the hole was. And now it's still flexible. It's secure on both sides. I could certainly work over this a little bit more, maybe. I could wash it and I would be, very confident that this is now good. But that took, maybe less than 5 minutes to use my depilling comb to shave a little bit of fuzz off my sweater, to gather it around the hole and then just felt it down. And if you have a sweater you love that's, say, an interesting shade of green or purple or something where you are not confident that you're going to be able to find roving to match, this can be a really good technique because it's a perfect color match. It came off of the garment you are trying to repair. So no more hole. Now, this right here, these are a couple larger holes you can see.
Anna, actually that brings up another question about if there's a limit to the size of the hole that can be repaired this way.
Yes, absolutely. So that is just what I was saying earlier about how I wouldn't go too much larger than, say, 2 inches. I would definitely say, if the hole is bigger than your palm, it's probably too large. You could definitely create a felted repair, but I don't think it would be as secure. Part of the reason why this works is because your felting kind of velcros onto this surface, and then you've got a nice material. But the more you're just building the felt upon itself, the more possibility there is for things to get a little bit weird. So here I am just gonna mix some colors. One interesting technique you can do is you can try and mimic the design of, say, a tweed or suiting, because you don't want to throw out your nice wool suit just because a moth decided to eat some of it. You can mix colors as you work. Say if you got some gray and some black, you can create sort of a subtly striped design, or you can create different features just based on how you lay down your roving. So this can be a really good repair technique for wool suits as well. Sylvia says, can you make a felted patch to apply over or under a larger area? I think you absolutely could. Yes, you could, Sylvia. I would love to see, I don't know, what you tried to do with that. So now, because I've laid this down, I would probably want to spray this with water, but I don't have a water bottle at hand, so I am just going to go dry felt. And you can see, even though I started with a soft roving, this is felting down as a pretty straight line. The way you apply it to the surface is the way it is going to look. So if I was trying to mimic a plaid, if I had a hole there and I wasn't sure, if I was ever going to find a patch that was a similar plaid, or I wasn't sure if I was ever going to find the right shade of wool yarn, I could do this with roving just by teasing the roving into the right shape. You can keep your edges really soft. That's why I'm leaving all of these loose fibers. I think that they will help the patch feel more secure. This way, I'm not just asking, one small area to bear the weight of the patch, but it's kind of Velcroed onto the surface of the wool all over. And particularly if you're trying to do an invisible mend, the further out these tails go into the design, the more your eye will kind of just pass over the repair and won't see it as a harshly defined area that's suddenly a different, type of material, that's a different color. The more that this kind of feathers out, the more natural it will look. You always want to flip it over because it will leave a real haze on the back. There. Virginia says, where has this technique been your whole life? Oh, I have no idea. I found it on the internet. It's great. So I could go back and add a little bit more. As I hold this up to the light, I'm seeing that these are still pretty translucent. So in that case, if, I hold this sweater up and this is not translucent, but this is, I would go back and add more because I do want to create a solid repair that I don't have to do more than once. So if you're wondering, have I used enough roving? Have I used too much? I would use that tip of holding it up to the light and trying to make these two areas about the same to be your guide. So lastly, I just want to show you how to do this on a suit, on some suiting material. This is kind of fun, a fun little jacket I don't wear it anymore because it does have a couple holes that are sort of right up by your face. They're hard to ignore. It does have a lining. And if I were doing this professionally, if I wanted to make this really secure, I would open up this seam and I would slip this pad in between the lining and the outside of the suit jacket. But I have not done that today and I don't want to wait to do that. So we are just going to go for this. If you are trying to pick what color roving to use, I would suggest you always go a shade darker. I would rather use a dark brown on this than, say, a green that's a little too bright, because darker colors are going to recede from your eye. They're going to be less eye-catching. And when I do an invisible repair, that is really what I'm thinking about, is what's going to be the least eye-catching, what's going to allow me to ignore this rather than draw the eye to it. So I'm just going to use a really small piece of roving. And I might wind up layering here. I'll start with just a little bit there. And you can see when I started, I did a couple little punctures right around the edges. That's to make sure that I've got the edges in the right spot. I like to work from the edges going in towards the center. I think that that makes sure that you know that it's spread out where you want it to be. There. And then just really go over it nicely, securely. You can see, well, now it looks like a stain, but either way, it no longer is that bright white of the shoulder pad underneath. And if I had something that was a little bit greener, if I had a darker green, I'm pretty confident that that would be a really invisible repair. So it did felt down the lining in the back. That would be a reason why you'd want to open it up and get in between the lining and the jacket. But just for a fix, hopefully no one will notice that. Now, Virginia said, you mentioned washing with Dawn dishwashing liquid. Does it have to be Dawn, or are other brands okay? Other brands are great. I love Dawn. I think it works really well with the oils that are in wool, but I honestly haven't explored, Sparkle or whatever the other brands are. So I would say that I always trust that, but really any dishwashing liquid is going to be good at pulling off the type of food stains that you want to make sure are not in your wool. That's what's really attractive to moths. Food stains. And so I love that for cleaning sweaters that I know moths have been attracted to. So it's the enzymes that are meant to break down food on your dishes. They will also break down any particles that might be on your sweater. So those are the basics. I'm thinking, Mina, maybe if you take hand cam off of Spotlight, we could chat a little bit. And I'm happy to go back and show any techniques or talk about anything else. But yeah, that's kind of, those are the basic techniques of needle felting for repairs.